Hello and welcome to the first video of the series. This is a series done in collaboration with two of my colleagues where we will be covering the CAPS curriculum for South African IT. Uh, in this course, I will be taking over the beginner and intermediary programming parts, and this will be focusing on the Delphi IDE, interactions with the OS, and the most basic form of procedural or functional programming. My friend Quibus will then be taking over the database design part of the tutorial, in which case he will cover Microsoft Access Database and the interactions between a database system and a Delphi program. And another colleague of mine will be covering OO and object-oriented design and principles. So that's all to come later in this series. In this first video, I just wanted to introduce the series and then also to introduce you guys to the Delphi IDE. So let's go ahead and install that right now. So what we'll start with is obviously having to download the IDE, and Embarcadero has recently decided to sponsor a community edition. Um, the community edition is free to use for non-commercial use or for commercial use up to 50,000 US dollars. Um, After that point, you are required to purchase a new license, but that shouldn't be a problem as of yet. Um, okay, so you will be going to the Embarcadero products page. Um, I'll leave a link down in the description below. You just sign up for a new account, hit download now. That will redirect you to a page that will then automatically detect your operating system and install the correct um, software or download the correct installer for your OS and system. As I've already done this, I can just close out of here, open up downloads. So something you should see then after registering for the community edition is you will receive an email with a product key. This will be your registration key for when we actually use or install Delphi. Okay, so at this point, I would highly recommend you guys go and read the Delphi RAD Studio license agreement and privacy policy. This will again outline the restrictions of a community edition, such as the free commercial use up to 50,000 US dollars in revenue. Hit next. Okay, on this system, I've already used Delphi, so I can just click on Use Existing License. In your case, you will need to hit Enter New License, click on Install, then it will prompt you for your license key that you have received by email. Let's go ahead and install. This will install the main components. Thereafter, we will actually be prompted by RAD Studio to select a few packages that we can then use to develop apps for various systems such as Android or iOS. This is obviously out of the scope of this series, but if you want to play around with it, there are brilliant resources online. Delphi does have limited resources next to some more uh, modern or contemporary languages, but it's still available online and you should be able to find a tutorial to fit your needs. Okay, as you can see, we are now being prompted with the platform selection that we want to use. We can choose between the two versions of Windows, Windows 32 and 64-bit. Important note, this is not the system that you are working on. This is the platform that you are targeting or planning to run your applications on. So in this case, it should be safest to install both, but you will most probably only ever be developing for 32-bit Windows as far as this series goes. You also have the ability to develop for Mac and iOS, as well as for Android. These should be working through the FileMonkey UI system, but we won't be covering that in this series. There are additional packages that you can install. I leave it to you to decide if you want to, but I do want you guys to use the help package. This will allow us to have an interactive help manual inside the Delphi IDE to then use whenever we need something. Something we found is in a few tests they never actually disabled the help function, so you could just gorge through the documentation in the middle of the exam. Um, should probably not mention that, but install the help package so that you can then just have a look at the documentation. This is really the best way to actually check up on certain features of the language and also to learn how stuff works. Then we can go and hit install. Okay, this installation process will take a little while. It first has to download all of the packages that we selected and then install them. So while Delphi goes ahead and does that, let's have a talk about why we are teaching you guys Delphi instead of a language like C# or Java. The reality is, Delphi, as it sits now, as it is incorporated into the RAD Studio, allows us to perform rapid application development, which means that we can really quickly develop an application that is up to industry standard, that we can then package and produce or deploy to users. It really eases the design and implementation stages of a project. Furthermore, Delphi actually compiles to a native binary. Uh, in the case of Java and C#, they are both running on virtual platforms, not necessarily running on the hardware itself or on the OS. It runs on top of a virtual machine, in the case of a Java virtual machine and the .NET framework. Okay, this means that they're not slow languages. They are still really good for most applications. Uh, but in applications where speed is absolutely required, you'd rather choose a faster language that compiles to native binary, such as C++ or Delphi in this case, which was surprising to me when I first found that out. Furthermore, Delphi itself provides an amazing suite of database connectivity components. Um, of course, you can connect any language you want to any database that's out there. Web interactions are almost standard across any language, so you have to be able to do it. But the thing is that Delphi and RAD Studio come with built-in support for these systems, which is extremely nice to have. It's also what it's extremely nice to have. It's also what allows us to iterate as quickly as we do when we are designing and implementing an application with Delphi. But then that begs the question, why did Delphi not surge in popularity? Why isn't it a market leader? Why do we still use Java or C#? And the reason for that is probably just a bad reputation. So we are very fortunate to now actually have a community edition that we can just download and install and use as a hobbyist coder or a student who wants to learn. Okay, uh, but this privilege was not always available to us. Only in the past 2 years did they actually release this community license. Before that, you had to spring 200 US bucks just to be able to install this RAD Studio and to use it. Now you want to try and tell a programmer that for his hobby program that he can write for free in C# or Java, he now has to pay 200 US dollars to not be able to sell because it was a hobby program. It was a simple utility that he wanted himself. Um, that really curbed enthusiasm because I mean, you're not going to go out and buy a license for a IDE suite or a language that you are limited to using. You aren't going to go out and buy a license for a language when you can easily go and use Java or C# or C++ or Python or any of the other plethora of languages that we have at our disposal that have the same capabilities as Delphi, might not be as fast, might have a few trade-offs. C++ might be a bit harder to learn and not have as many built-in functionalities, but it's easy to extend. So why go out and use Delphi? Another problem that really then almost sealed the coffin until recently was the fact that you won't want to learn a language that no one's using. Because the fact of the matter is, when you learn a language or when you learn to program, you want to be able to use that skill to build applications for a business, or you want to actually be a developer. In both of these cases, you will find that you want to use the language that the industry is using. You want to know the technologies that are needed in today's marketplace. A big thing to consider is the fact that you want to know the language that everyone will pay you to know. If you know C sharp and you can then quickly develop systems for enterprise applications, that's brilliant. You now have a skill or a application that you can write and just package and sell off. Or if you are working on a game engine or anything of the like and you know C++, you are in high demand because now you have to be on the forefront of performance and you actually have a skill to write an application to that level, and you can use C++. Um, Delphi, with its relatively low popularity up until recently, really did mean that we don't have as many developers that want to learn Delphi because it's not used in the industry, which I think is a bit of a misnomer. It really does have a place in the marketplace. Uh, it really is good at designing enterprise systems, and it should have a bit more love than it does. Um, I personally didn't like Delphi much myself, but that should actually be because I started by learning C++. So uh, everything I'm saying here is because when I learned Delphi, I actually went and asked a teacher, why are we learning Delphi? I don't want to learn Delphi when I could be learning Java or any other language and actually be able to use that. I mean, that should prepare me better for a IT degree or the market. And they had an answer, but it wasn't an answer that was nearly as researched or as nuanced as the one I'm trying to provide you guys now. So I really never liked Delphi because I never had a good reason to learn Delphi. Um, but I do believe that it is a good language to learn a solid foundation in that you can then use to apply to other languages, because you can then easier learn all the new syntaxes. And that's basically what programming is all about. You learn to code, and then whatever language you have to code in, you just learn the new syntax. So that's what we are hoping to do now. We want to teach you guys to program. That's going to be the main focus of the series. I will cut here and meet back up with you guys once we have the final installed IDE, and I will take you guys on a tour of the Delphi IDE. So after you have finished the install, we can click on Start Working. Then when we open the IDE, we will then have to do a initial setup. Okay, uh, we are asked what theme we want to use, and obviously it's modern times, we want to use dark. Kidding, use whichever one you want. Then you are asked if we want to configure a source control or version control. In this case, I do recommend that you do some research or reading on Git and version control using Git and GitHub, but that's outside of the scope of the series, and I won't be using it for the projects that we are working on. Yeah, I believe that's everything that has to be done. So we can just click on Get Started. It will then do the configuration and we will be let into the environment. Importantly, in this series, what we will be working with is Windows VCL applications. This is the Visual Component Library. It's a special set of components provided by Embarcadero and the RAD Studio, which we can use to quickly and efficiently create Windows applications. Okay, this is what you will see when you open a new project in Delphi. In the center, we have a design view. This is where we will actually be designing our application and adding stuff like buttons, panels, edit boxes, whichever things you want the user to interact with, you will design it here. Okay. Top right, we see a project layout. This just says which files make out our program. In this case, we are currently working with unit1.pass. In future, not necessarily in the videos that I do, but definitely in the videos that Quibus covers, you will be creating another file that will then handle all the database connection components. And I do believe we will actually be looking at how to use multiple forms in Delphi, which I will then be covering. Bottom right, this is the tool palette. This is where we can then access stuff like labels, edits, buttons. Everything that you want the user to interact with will be located here before we actually place it onto the form. Bottom left, we have the Object Inspector. The Object Inspector allows us to set up the properties of certain objects. We will have a more in-depth look at this as the series progresses, but an important point I want you to take note of is anything that can be edited in the Object Inspector or the properties can be changed programmatically while we run our code. Very useful if we want to resize components, change components color, change designs, enable or disable certain components, and the like. On the left, we see the structure panel. This shows what components are used in our application at this point in time, and it takes the form of a tree. An important part about visual programming is the fact that we have containers that can then have components stacked onto them. In this case, our form is our root component. This is the earliest component that you will ever be working with. And if we then decide to add a panel to this form, we can then see in the structure panel that it adds it as a child of the form. Now, if we then decide to add components to the panel, we can again see that it gets added as a child of the panel, which is a child of the form in the structure view. And you can also add multiple children to a certain panel. An important thing to note is the fact that you can then easily move children from one parent to another. This will then change how the layout works, how it's structured, because when a component is stacked on top of another component, such as adding a panel or an edit to the panel, we can then see it has to be contained within that panel. And if we resize the panel, we have to also make sure that we leave enough space for the components to be shown. Furthermore, what we want to have a look at, if you look bottom right, right next to design, you see the code button. This is where we will actually be writing our code for our applications. We will be dealing with this in the next episode when I show you guys a basic program, and this is where we are going to spend the bulk of our time designing an application that takes minutes, half an hour. Writing the code to implement the functionality that we need, that might take a bit more time. Going back to design, if we look at the top, important things to notice is the big green arrow. This is the run button. When we run our application here, it will start the application, build it, and then run it. So we can see we have a form that is extremely boring because it has nothing on it that we can then interact with. Then next to that, we've got the run command. So this is run without debugging, this is run. The difference being that if we decide, if in code we have a certain piece of code that's misbehaving and we want to find out where it is, we can actually go and make a breakpoint by double clicking on a line. And then when we run with debugging, the program will stop execution at that point, and we can then step through code to find out where it's breaking. We can also inspect variables with debugging when we have such breakpoints. These are things that we will be covering in a later video. I really want to dedicate an entire video just to debugging, because importantly, you've got various different types of bugs that you have to track down. For example, you have logic errors, which you can't find necessarily with debugging tools or by running your program. And then you've got actual syntax errors, which we will find out when you actually run your code and it doesn't work. That should be everything covered for this first video. I thank you guys for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one where we build a basic Delphi program. Until then, have a good day.